It's so great to be here. I'm very grateful to be here to talk with you. Rob, that was amazing, inspirational. I did a 200-mile trek across the Arctic once, and I felt really good about it until like now. We were listening to Neil Young in our tent at night, and we thought it was really a big achievement. And listening to your stories, I realized.
Respect to you.
Yeah. I fear that I am going to be the darkness that Amy talked about in her introduction. I am going to talk about a complicated thing here, the sort of underside. This is not a sort of conventionally inspirational story that I'm going to talk about. It does interestingly follow from a lot of what Rob talked about. A lot of you heard Mike Brune talk last night about, we're here, he talked about how this is an important moment for all of us who care about climate change and about environment and things that, well, obviously with the Trump administration, what's going on, it's really important to think deeply about what's happening. He underscored that we're making a lot of progress in clean energy. We're doing a lot of things right. We need to broaden the movement, deepen it, include people who have not been part of it before. And I think that's all really true. I thought Mike said it really well last night. But I also think it's really important to acknowledge where we are and to not look at all this with sort of rosy glasses. And the truth is that CO2 levels are higher than they've ever been in the history of human life, as long as human beings have been on the planet. And we have a lot of climate change in store for us. Things are going to happen. Big changes are going to happen in the world no matter what we do, whether we all sell our SUVs and ride skateboards. We're already going to be facing a rapidly changing planet. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. And one of the things that we're going to be facing is rising seas. And I realized after listening to the mayor talk today and the problems with the aquifer here that this might sound like a good story. The water is coming, oh good, to talk about in Idaho. And I realized that it's sort of, we're not going to be having high tides on Main Street here. If we do, it's going to have lots of other troubles. But I think that we all know, people who live on coasts, I think that we all can see what an incredible transformation this will be if cities like Miami are underwater. If cities like New York are threatened with rising seas. We've already seen what happened with Sandy. And I think that one of the really important things about climate change and this whole movement that we're all part of is we all understand is that this is a global thing. What happens, we're all connected. This is not just about what happens here or what happens in New York or what happens in India or what happens in China. We're all together in this. And a molecule of CO2 emitted in Poland has the same impact on the climate as a molecule of CO2 emitted in Idaho. And so this is one of those stories about us all being in this together. As Amy said, I've written about climate change for a long time. I've thought about a lot of things. I wrote about the coal industry. But I'd been to talk to scientists who talked to me about sea level rise and everything, but it just never, I was like, yeah, okay, there's lots of problems in the world. This was not something that was front and center in my mind. And then Hurricane Sandy happened in New York. I wasn't in New York at the time, but I was there a couple days later, and I walked around and saw what had happened to the city. And I realized, well, what happens if this water that just came in, it went out after 6 hours or 10 hours or whatever, as the tide and the storm surge retreated? What happens if that water doesn't go away? What does New York look like if that water stays in? And it was sort of like a preview of what sea level rise might look like. And I started to talk to some scientists in New York and think about this. We started to have conversations, and one of the scientists said to me, well, New York, yes, but thank God we're not in Miami. And I was like, well, what's the problem with Miami? And they said, go have a look. So I went to Miami, and I happened to be there on what they call the king tides. And I was walking around Miami Beach in places where, rock stars have $10 million condos, and the water was up to my knees in the streets of Miami. I talked to a few geologists, and it's very clear Miami has very low topography. It's built on a porous limestone, meaning you can't really build walls. And a lot of real estate, as you know, right on the water. And so it became very clear to me that Miami is in big trouble very, very, very soon. And I thought, this is very interesting. This is a very interesting story to think about. And that's what launched me on this book. And I spent 3 years traveling around the world, looking at sea level rise, thinking about sea level rise, thinking about how different countries, different places are dealing with it. And I want to be very brief today. I just want to share with you basically 3 things that I learned on this journey. And by the way, I just finished the book like 2 weeks ago. This is the first time I've talked about it anywhere. And so I'm very happy to do that here. 3 thoughts about sea level rise. So the first one that's really important is the title of the book, The Water Will Come. The real question is how high, how fast. So last time CO2 levels in the atmosphere were where they are now, sea levels were 70 feet higher. So that means that when the equilibrium, there's a lot of heat built up in the oceans. When that heat equilibrializes, the ice melts eventually, sea levels are 70 feet higher. We don't know that that's exactly where they're going to go, but this question of how fast and how far the seas are going to rise is really important. It's also really, really important. I know we're going to talk a lot about clean energy and the importance of cutting emissions here, but it's really important to understand on sea level rise is that it's going to happen anyway. It's not going to be stopped. We can slow it down, we can make the rise perhaps a little bit less, but we're going to be seeing rising seas for the next couple centuries, basically no matter what we do. And this rate of the change is what's really important. Some of you may know that there have been all kinds of scientists are working very hard to figure out how fast it's going to come and how soon. The IPCC, which is the scientific consensus, talks about anything from 1 to 3 feet, but it's wide by 2100. That's sort of their benchmark idea, but it's widely viewed among scientists that those are sort of out of date. The melting of ice in Greenland and Antarctica is very complex. How it happens, how fast it's going to happen. NOAA, just before Trump was elected and was still allowed to speak the truth, our top science agency raised the possible levels of sea level rise by 2100 to 8 feet. And I talked with Jim Hansen, the godfather of climate change science. Most of you probably know who he is. He's the man who first testified in Congress about the risks of climate change. He thinks it could go as high as 12 or 13 feet. And it's kind of hard to bend your mind around sort of what that means. This is the Larsen C ice shelf, the crack that we're going to be hearing a lot about, I think probably within like 3 days. I think it's going to break off very, very soon. And it is not in itself going to change sea level rise all that much because of the ice shelf is already floating and there's not a lot of glaciers sort of behind it. But it's, again, I think you call it an alarm bell or like, hey, pay attention. And that's sort of what this is. It's like, this is happening now. And this is another sort of shout out. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago about what's going on in West Antarctica. And scientists had always thought, oh, ice melts like an ice cube on a picnic table. It's like, oh, you put it out in the heat, and the hotter it is, the slower it melts, the faster it melts, and you can kind of figure out a Greenland and Antarctica are big ice cubes, and you can do all kinds of physics and figure out how long it'll take to melt. But one of the things that scientists are figuring out now is that ice melts at a certain rate, and you can time that, but it fractures very fast. And so what's happening in West Antarctica is that you've got warming oceans coming up underneath the ice, because a lot of the ice these glaciers have thousands of feet of ice, are exposed to thousands of feet of water underneath. They're marine glaciers. They're melting from below, and as they melt from below, it changes the sort of ice dynamics, and they can just like fall apart. They just can fracture very fast. So the science is pushing us towards understanding that this is going to be happening faster and faster. And of course, the problem is, this is a picture I took from a helicopter of the Miami River. If you are on the beach and the water comes too high, it's pretty simple what you do. You just like pick up your towel and you move back. That's harder to do when you have big condos worth hundreds of millions of dollars built right on the water. And anybody everybody knows that this is, I could have taken a picture of any of 50 cities in America and had a similar thing. The problem with this is, okay, water rises, it's coming in, what happens? You don't just, what do you do with these buildings? What do you do with, it's the infrastructure that's at risk here. It's the fact that we've built in this place thinking that we live on this static planet. That, oh, the water's there, okay, we can build right next to it, and it'll be really cool. Because everybody loves to live by water. And we're going to test that thesis soon. So this is I'm going to show you what's going to happen to Miami. So this is Miami. I think you can see that little island there, sandbar is Miami Beach. This is Virginia Key here. This is downtown Miami there in the center. That's a picture of a LiDAR image of Miami Beach. And this is what it looks like with 7 feet of sea level rise. And again, 7 feet is below what NOAA says is possible by 2100. All of the dark is underwater. So you can see Miami Beach is completely submerged. And you can see this thing about Miami is that the water comes in from the back because of the Everglades. It's all so low, and the Everglades rise because they're, of course, connected down below. The water comes in from behind. And so over here you have, of course, from one of Trump's golf courses. We're not too sad about that, in Doral. But you also have a lot of working class neighborhoods and things here, places like Sweetwater, Hialeah, that have no idea that this is going to happen to them, that this is possible. So it's a very sort of upsetting scenario. But you can see nature reclaiming the old passageways that were cut out when the sea levels were this level before. The rivers get broader and these glades open up. But I don't have it with me, but if I did the same thing with 9 feet of sea level rise, you would see it's gone. South Florida ends at Orlando. And that's coming. 7. So, and then the other sort of myth about this idea of thinking about sea level rise is that it's not like, New York or Miami or Shanghai, wherever you want to name. It's not like it's all okay and then it's Atlantis. It's like, we're fine and then we have to get boats and we have to, build an underwater city. It's not like that. The problem with sea level rise is incremental. It's this is a picture I took in Venice. First of all, this is a place where it's already happening, right? So you already have this water coming in. You already have huge problems that begin with things like septic systems that don't drain anymore. So this water, I've been in similar situations in Miami and things, it's not like pretty water. It's not like this is like, oh, let's go swim in Piazza San Marco. This is water that's full of chemicals, full of sewage, ugly, dirty, don't put my feet in that water kind of stuff. And so when we think about cities beginning to flood, you have these issues, which brings up all kinds of questions about disease. You have huge problems with, this is the Marshall Islands. Water in these places, obvious problems with swimming, slums in the floods, but also problems with just drinking water. Right? In Miami and in the Marshall Islands, a lot of the water comes from underground wells. As the sea level comes up, those wells become salinated. You don't have drinking water. That's a big problem in a lot of places, and especially in places like Miami. So it doesn't require submersion to be a big issue. This is Miami, kayaking in Miami, which is something that we're increasingly seeing happen as the tides come up. But I want to go to the next one because the next one is a great infrastructure. So the infrastructure is the problem. So this is what the mayor of South Miami told me is the nuclear plant that's built in the stupidest place of any nuclear plant ever, which is saying something. But this is the Turkey Point nuclear plant, which is 15 miles south of Miami. And you can see where it's built. It's built right on the water. And you can see with 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise, what kind of problems we're going to have. You think about 7 feet of sea level rise, and this is completely submerged. And you think about the problems of a nuclear plant submerged, and you think about the problems of a nuclear plant run by a power company that doesn't want to admit that sea level rise is happening, in a state with a governor who doesn't want to admit that sea level rise is happening. And you realize why people in Miami are a little freaked out who think about this. And you also start to think about the enormity of the infrastructure changes that are going to happen. Miami Airport is already floods at high tides. They have to really think about what to do in Miami. You have to think about moving the airports very soon. How do you move an airport? I mean, obviously you can build a runway anywhere, but all the stuff, the roads, the whole thing, it's monumental challenge of infrastructure. And this is just like with a little flooding. We're not talking about Atlantis here. We're talking about in the next 20 or 30 years is what's going to happen. So there's going to be billions that are going to be spent on adaptation, right? We're going to spend a lot of money building seawalls. We're going to spend a lot of money moving roads, elevating houses, things like that. This is Chicago in the 1890s. You can elevate a city. In Chicago, the city was booming in the middle of the 19th century as the westward expansion happened. They just started building on the side of the lake, and then at a certain point they said, ah, shit, we're building too close to the water. Septic sewage lines won't drain. We're getting floods all the time. We've got disease. We're going to just like raise the city. And they just decided we're going to raise Chicago 8 feet. And they did. These are all like little corkscrews under this giant hotel. The hotel didn't even close. There's stories about people like having their tea as the giant hotel is rising. And they just had like 3,000 men with corkscrews doing it a little bit at a time. And in like 3 weeks, they raised this building. They put their corkscrews out and went to the next building and raised them. And then they just laid the septic lines on the street and then covered it all over with dirt, and they had a city that was 8 feet higher. There were 40,000 people living in Chicago at the time, so this was not a trivial deal. So it can be done, right? But it's a little bit different when you think about a place like New York or Miami or Boston, or again, Shanghai or any other city you want to name that's at risk, where you have a lot of people who, you know, in Miami, people get pissed off if the road's closed for repaving for 2 weeks. People flip out. Like, I'm paying my tax dollars, what the hell's going on? You know, I can't get home from work. The idea of actually trying to raise the entire city is maybe engineering, it may be possible, but the costs and the inconvenience of it are huge. The other thing you can do is build walls. So after Sandy in New York, they thought, oh, they got $60 billion in funds from HUD to begin to raise things, and it was a big wake-up call. And one of the things they want to do is do this thing called the Big U, which is basically a giant wall around Lower Manhattan. They're already starting, they haven't broke ground yet, but they will, I think, in the next 6 months on the top part of it, on the East River, a small section of it up there. And this wall, no one knows exactly how much it would cost, but something in the neighborhood of $6 or $7 billion maybe. But it can be done. Right? I mean, New York has a lot of money. This is Wall Street. This is the most valuable real estate in the world. They're going to build a wall there. This is going to happen. Who's going to pay for it? What exactly it will look like? It can be done. But walls have all kinds of problems, right? Walls, the main problem is who's behind it and who's not. Right? It's great if you have a house in Soho and they put up an 8-foot wall and you feel safe. But if you live in Red Hook, you know, they're not going to, Rem Koolhaas is not going to design a wall for, you know, Red Hook and Brooklyn. And so there's going to be billions of dollars spent protecting kind of privileged real estate and things. It's a recipe for a kind of real social problems. And it's also a problem if walls fail. You know, they fall down. They get crushed. They don't. Big waves come that happened during the tsunamis in Japan. A lot of people in Hurricane Katrina were killed when levees that they thought were strong failed. There's a lot of problems with just building walls. And this is the great. This is the Mosey. This is a drawing of the Mosey Barrier in Venice. This is the great kind of cautionary tale when it comes to thinking about we're just going to engineer our way out of this. Venice is obviously a water city and obviously sinking. People know about this. But they did this amazing thing, which was to they decided 25 years ago they were going to build this wall to keep the water out, the sea out. They, being Italians, wanted to do a really cool wall. One of the guys I talked to when I was there calls it the Ferrari on the seafloor. Because it goes down when the tides are low, and then it comes up when the tides or storms are just coming. And this is it coming up here. But the problem is, first of all, being Italy, it was projected to cost $3 billion. It ended up costing $6 billion. And about $1.5 billion of that went to ski houses and vacations for a lot of the contractors and politicians who were involved in it. So a huge amount of corruption. And then, because they designed it 25 years ago, they thought, oh, we'll build it for like 10 inches of sea level rise. So that'll be fine. So they've spent $6 billion on a project that is supposed to last 50 years to protect them from sea level rise that is far below the best projections. Right? If you were building this now and you were like thinking about it in a coherent way, you would think, well, we need to think about what we're going to do with 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise, not 10 inches. So it's already basically obsolete. Plus, there's now mollusks growing in the hinges, and they have sand in it. It's not working right. It's just a debacle of like billions of dollars spent on infrastructure. This is an interesting solution, which is a floating schoolhouse. So you can build floating architecture. Right? I think one of the inspiring things that's going to happen is people are going to build all kinds of floating schools, floating buildings, floating houses. This is one in Lagos, which I visited. It's a floating schoolhouse. It was done by a very well-known architect, and it got a lot of attention. Unfortunately, a big storm came by and blew it down. So that was unfortunate. And this is, again, a creative vision. This is an architect I knew, who I spent a lot of time with in Miami. We were thinking about what this vision of the future is going to be, because I think that what's going to happen is that, you know, these coastal cities are going to be, people are going to have to start thinking differently about how to live. That's like, people are going to have to think differently about how to live without water in places like this. And people are going to have to think differently about how to live with water in places like Miami. So this, I asked my friend, who's a really well-known architect there, to make some sketches. And this is a platform city he designed. It's basically out on pillars. It's not unlike a lot of primitive houses or buildings you would see in Bangkok or in Lagos or places that are sort of on stilts, except it's, you know, $1 million condos. And you can see boats pulling up, and you can imagine a cool life. You go to Venice, you think, well, you know, my first thought when I went to Venice for this book was like, we fucked up. We should have lived with like this all the time. It's so cool. Boats everywhere and like no cars. And it's like we made a big mistake not living with the water. So in a way, this is allowing his vision of how we will return to this. And I think there's going to be a ton of kind of creative destruction happening around this. In fact, one of the developers that I talked to in Miami, he was like, I'm buying a Hummer because I want this to happen as fast as possible. Because there's a lot of real estate in Miami, for example, that he can't redevelop because it's historical. And it's historical, some of it's really like great historical, like the Art Deco area. Some of it's just like, to my eye, just like weird 50s crappy buildings that somebody thinks was, you know, has been valued as historical. And he wants to build it down, knock it down, and build better, way more expensive, high-value real estate that's LEED certified, elevated, make it better. And so he thinks that he can get zoning freedom as we begin to acknowledge that this is coming. So he's looking forward to all of this. So I think that there's this idea of, you know, a kind of new vision of living that's going to happen as a result of this rising water. And in my book, I try to talk about that a little bit, and I think that there is, even though this is there's going to be enormous destruction because of these waters coming into these cities and a lot of displacement. I haven't even talked about the complications of political refugees, people leaving, people coming, you know, to Idaho. You're going to have a lot of people from, you know, Tampa living in Idaho in like the next few decades. There's actually been studies showing about where people are going to be migrating to. It's going to have a massive like Dust Bowl-like change in how people live. They're going to have to really abandon the coastlines in the ways that we know about it. So what really the 3 things that really matter in all of this is elevation, right? It's one thing to live on the coast in Miami, when you're right on the water. Even 2 and 3 feet of elevation have huge consequences with this. Of course, if you're living in New York and you're up in Washington Heights on 200 feet of granite, it's a whole different story than if you're living in Red Hook. Already realtors are beginning to sell properties with elevation in mind. I think this is going to become more and more of a part of the story and more about how we think about this and about how we think about living on the coast. The other thing that's going to matter is money. It's very simple. If you have money, you're going to do better in all of this because you can move, you can rebuild your house, you can elevate your house. The people who are really going to be screwed in this are people who can't afford to move, who are trapped in houses, trapped in real estate, trapped in communities for all kinds of reasons that can't afford to adapt, can't afford to easily sell their place. Cities that are rich, Lower Manhattan is going to do a lot better in all of this than, as I said, Red Hook. Miami Beach is going to do a lot better in this than Sweetwater. It's going to be a real divider of rich and poor, I think. And the final thing that's, of course, going to matter is political leadership, because what's really going to have to happen in all this, we can talk about engineering, we can talk about all this, is going to be a retreat. And it's a very un-American idea. Nobody wants to talk about retreat. Nobody wants to talk about giving up land. Nobody wants to talk about, having to give their domains back to nature. We think of ourselves as a very technologically sophisticated world. We don't think of nature winning. But nature is going to win this. I was talking to a scientist who said, nobody wins wars with water. And she said, look at the Grand Canyon. And it's true. I mean, the Grand Canyon is a testament to the power of water. And I think we're going to see the power of water demonstrated very clearly on our coastlines around the world in the coming decades. And that's my... Thank you.